Okay. Hi, Alan. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Hey, Douglas, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, it's nice to have you with us. And today we're going to be talking about your book, specifically Two Degrees, it's called. Is that the full title?
Yeah, that's the new one.
Oh, okay. All right, great. How many books have you written at this point, or published, I
This,
should say?
yeah, but that's a good distinction because I've actually written more than I've published. I think at this point this is number 18.
Oh, wow. Lots of books.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I made that distinction a while back because a lot of authors, they say, oh, I've written about 40 books. How many have you published? Two. You know,
right. It's
so
the truth.
I know the feeling having stuff just stuck in a drawer somewhere that's not quite finished. Now, all of your books are children's books?
Yeah. So a couple at the beginning of my career were more what we call young adult in the business. I mean, I guess for like ages 14 and up. But really, most of my books, let's say 16 of them, are really what you'd call middle grade, shooting for ages like 8 to 14, somewhere in there, like what a lot of people think of as middle school or upper elementary.
Have you been doing this to support yourself, or do you do something else as well?
Now, this is my full-time job, which is pretty great. I'm pretty lucky.
Oh, that is great. Has it always been?
Yeah, so the story behind that is really interesting. I'll try to keep it somewhat short, but in 2002, my daughter was born, and my wife and I had to decide if one of us was going to stay home and take care of her, if we were both going to keep doing our day jobs. I was an eighth grade English teacher at the time. I'd been sending out books, but hadn't gotten anything published, and so my wife said, in words that will live in infamy in my household, you've wanted to be a writer since you were a kid. You've been working on it in your evenings and your weekends and your summers home. Why don't you stay home, be a stay-at-home dad, and try to make this happen? Try to sell your first book. And I'd been getting good rejection letters. There is such a thing. I was getting letters that said, "You're close. Keep trying." And so I did. I quit my job, stayed home. I was more of a dad at first than I was a writer. You know, when you got a baby at home, it's kind of your number one job. But while she was napping, when I could hand her off to my wife, I would run down to my office and work on writing books. And the very first book I wrote while I was a stay-at-home dad was the very first book I had published, Samurai Shortstop. And I've been really lucky to be a full-time writer, so to speak, ever since. You know, if we count my dad stuff at the beginning, by the time my daughter was old enough to go to school, I was established enough to stay home.
I'm happy to hear
Yeah,
that. And now, the other books that you've written, before we get to Two Degrees,
sure.
are all of your books, this one, Two Degrees, is about climate change. Are all of your books, do they all have a message of some sort of seriousness? Uh,
Not really. At the beginning of my career, I always like to say something with my books. I like them to have a theme, but they don't always. And at the beginning of my career, I wrote sports novels, I wrote murder mysteries, I wrote fantasy novels and science fiction novels, some contemporary stuff as well. And sometimes I would work different themes into those books, but it really wasn't until I guess I wrote Prisoner B3087, which is the first of these black and white and red books. You know, the cover of this one looks black and white and red, and that's a format that my publisher has used ever since Prisoner B3087, which was a book about the Holocaust, and it's based on the true story of a guy that I got to meet and interview and work with on the book. His name was Jack Gruner, and as a kid he survived 10 different Nazi concentration camps during World War II.
wow.
And he wasn't a writer, but he had an amazing story. And so I partnered up with him to be the writer on that story. And ever since then, like that book got more fan mail than all of my other books combined. And I think that was book number 11 for me. And the number one thing kids said was, we want more books like this. You know, we want more books about World War II. We want more books about big topics and subjects. And so that's the way my career has gone, really, because the readers were asking for it. And it's books, it's stories I love to tell and that I'm very interested in telling, but really it's a response to the readers.
This might sound like a strange question, but when you're writing for, you said middle grade, so what age
hmm
is that? 13?
Yeah, it's like 8 to 14, like fifth, like what you might think of like fifth or sixth grade. up through 8th grade.
How do you differentiate writing for that age group rather than just writing for everybody? Do you have to use less big words, or, I mean, it sounds crazy, but I'm just curious, what would distinguish it from just, a regular book?
Sure. No, it's a great question. So, number one, when you're writing for that age group, you want your protagonist to be of that age. So, most of my protagonists are at the upper end of that, 12, 13, 14, because kids also like to read about kids who are their age or a little bit older. Most kids think it's very childish to read down, to read a character who's younger than them, because they're all grown up. They're big time. They don't need to read about somebody who's a year younger than they are, or 2 years. So number one, I always try to have a kid protagonist, and that's limiting because it means there are some stories about the past that are going to be very difficult to tell if children weren't involved in a central role, if they don't have agency in that story. But the other thing is, I really don't write down to kids in terms of choosing different vocabulary or anything like that. The only real concession that I make is that where I might describe something that's violent or scary in more detail for adults, I pull back on that for kids. So I don't hide that it happened. I mean, I wrote a book about the Holocaust, and I talk about the horrors of the Holocaust, but I don't have to describe them in visceral detail on the page. And that way, young readers can say, oh, now I know what happened, but they can fill in the blanks in their head. An older reader on the top of my range, 13 or 14 years old, might think, oh, I know exactly what that means, and fill in the blanks in their head. While a younger reader who's in upper elementary school might say, I don't know exactly the extent of what that means, but I understand that this bad thing happened. And then as they get older and more mature, they can fill in those blanks. So I really, other than that, I mean, I don't use any profanity in my books because I would like them to be read in schools, and some schools have problems with that and some schools don't. And so I just try to make sure I don't use profanity in my books. I guess that's another concession. But the big one is that I really just try to keep out the most visceral, gratuitous descriptions of violence and suffering. But I still talk about them. I still put them on the page because I think to sugarcoat anything like the Holocaust or a refugee crisis or terrorist attacks or war is to do real disservice to the people who went through those ordeals.
Well, I agree with you. So basically, it's the same as a movie rating, where
yeah, I would say
it's
so.
just not as graphic. The message is still there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You had mentioned protagonists. So are your books historical fictions?
A lot of the most recent ones have been. Now, 2 Degrees, the new one, is set in the present day, but a lot of my books recently, like those 8 books that I was talking about, including Prisoner B3087 and on, I've written about D-Day in a book called Allies. I wrote about the Battle of Okinawa in a book called Grenade. In Refugee, which is 3 different stories, one of those 3 stories is set in the present day, but another one is set in 1990, and the other one is set in 1939. And remember, 1990 is history for these kids. In fact, I wrote a book called Ground Zero, which is about 9/11, and it has 2 stories in it. One is a story that was set in the present day when the book came out, or at least very close to it. It was set in 2019. The book came out in 2021. But the other story is set on September 11th, 2001, which, again, for my age group, is historical fiction, even though for you and me, it's not.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing that most of the kids now weren't even born. In fact, I just had a guest on not too long ago who was born a year after. And, he's already 20 years old.
Yeah, that's my daughter. My daughter is a junior in college, and she was born in 2002.
Yeah, that's crazy. We just have a few minutes, but I do want to get a little bit more into your book, 2 Degrees. So this one you said is set in the present, and climate change is a big topic. We don't have time to cover the whole thing in 4 minutes, okay? But it's interesting to me because you've got people so vehemently on one side of the issue or the other. You've got people that are, I just saw something the other day about two people that went into the museum and threw soup all over a Van Gogh or something in
I saw
protest.
that clip as well. Yeah.
Okay. So you've got those people and people laying down in the road and all this. And then you've got people on the other side of the coin who say that it's just a hoax, that it's just a political leverage tool. There is nothing wrong. We're not in any danger. What in your book are you using as any scientific fact to back up what you're talking about? And it's a two-part question. The other question is, how alarmist is your book in terms of, is the world going to come to an end tomorrow? Or are we just needing to deal with this problem because it's going to get worse? Okay, what's the severity?
So to answer the first question, so I'm not a scientist. I'm not a climate change scientist, and I'm not a scientist in general. And so I have to rely. I'm also not an expert on D-Day. I'm not an expert on 9/11. I'm not an expert on most of the things I write about. What I do is I try to find people who are experts in those fields. Just the same way that I would find books from historians who have researched every angle of D-Day or 9/11, I looked for books from scientists who researched every angle of climate change. And so, to me, I'm like you. I mean, I don't know for myself scientifically. I haven't done tests and things to know anything about the climate. I'm not that person. So what I do is I rely on the people who are experts, and scientists, specifically climate scientists, are sure that this is what's happening. That since the dawn of the industrial era, about 200 years ago, around 1800, 1880, somewhere in that range, beginning of the industrial era, that human beings have been the main cause of temperature rise. And they've looked at the greenhouse gases that we're producing. They've done the science on how much heat we're trapping in the earth, and it's real. I've read a lot of books. I've read a lot of books from scientists who've written about this, and unfortunately, it's become politicized. And how alarmist am I? I talk about how it. Well, let's talk about what kind of a threat it is right now. The story is about a girl who's surviving wildfires in California. That's based on real life stuff that's been happening in the last 5 years. It's based on a girl who is surviving a hurricane in Florida. 2 weeks ago, we had Hurricane Ian that devastated the southwest coast of Florida. And if that were to hit the southeast coast, where Miami is, that's 3 million people in Miami-Dade County alone who'd be susceptible to that. And it's about 2 kids in Churchill, Manitoba, who are escaping polar bears who've come off the sea ice, which is another problem they're actually having because the sea ice is forming later in the season and melting earlier because of the climate, the temperature rise. We know that since the beginning of the industrial era, the average temperature of the Earth has risen about 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And 1 degree doesn't sound like a big change, but that's an average. And 1 degree around the equator, where it's much hotter, or at the poles, where it's already very cold, that can have a significant difference. I have a scientist friend who likes to say 1 degree doesn't seem like a big deal unless you're talking about whether ice freezes or whether it doesn't. 1 degree of temperature change there, and you get ice or water. So just that, and the Earth isn't rising evenly. Some places get hotter, some places stay cooler. So the science is there. It's frightening, and it's frightening enough the way that things are right now with the mega fires that we have and the stronger hurricanes that we have, with the melting tundra, that kind of thing, the melting sea ice as well. So how alarmist am I? I don't say that it's the end of the world, but I do say that if we don't really start taking it seriously, that within my readers' lifetimes, we could see devastating sea level rise. We could see more deadly wildfires throughout these dry regions like California, and it's happening up into Oregon and Washington and British Columbia now, and stronger and more deadly hurricanes. So they're saying, scientists think that by 2100, that that things could be beyond the point where we could reverse them. And that still seems like a science fiction date. But if my kids are 10 years old and they live until they're 90, that's within their life rate. That's close. That's kids. Yeah. Oh, yeah. If they're 10 years old now, they'll make it to 2100. So like that, we're talking about the lifetime of these kids. And so I'm just trying to spotlight where we are now and say, like, this is bad enough. Let's see if we can stop it here before it gets worse.
So we are out of time. I got to wrap this up.
Oh, shoot. Sorry.
That's okay. No problem. I was happy to hear it. So the book basically has a fictitious character, sort
Four
of
of them.
woven into a real life situation with climate
Right.
change. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Can you give out your website, please?
Oh, sure. It's www.alangratz.com, and I spell my name ALANGRATZ, alangratz.com.
Okay, super. And there's links to your book and information there?
Everything is there. You got it.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan, for coming on. Nice meeting you. Best
My
of luck.
pleasure.